boy, where to start? Because the way I see ego is a little deeper than others who may see it. Bear with me for a second. I've mentioned how using dopamine, the brain aggregates data points of information together to create a data point. These shapes and sounds coalesce with this color. But I want to try to change that. I want you to think that this color is blue instead. That the word blue matches the color. I don't want you to pretend for the sake of the video. I don't want you to form a hypothetical scenario where in another variation of life, it's possible for you to think that this color is blue. And I don't want you to care about what society thinks about it. Why should society care about what you think? Why should you care what society thinks? I want you to think that this color, for all intents and purposes, is blue. Heart, body, and soul. To the end of time. Did you change your mind? Do you believe it? It's completely fine if you didn't. In fact, I expected that you wouldn't. For most of you, that little exercise probably seemed a little ridiculous. You probably went ahead and relied on one of the above reasons anyway, despite my insistence. That is fine. I was expecting that. But did you notice the amount of resistance within yourselves as you heard the idea? Why was it so difficult to try to change it? What was the missing reason? Why was it ridiculous? That resistance is the ego at work. I mentioned in an earlier video about the Stroop test. Dopamine is the main chemical that creates the frameworks and patterns of our belief systems. If you look through the lens of the processing layers and the very deep layers, all that the ego is the attachment of our emotions to how a concept should operate and the brain's resistance to change its emotional patterns. There is an emotional impulse that rejects changing one concept to another. This color example is a micro example of the ego at work, or micro-ego, because why not? This includes this little jump of attaching shapes and sounds to a color. This emotional impulse attaches this concept to this concept. As I've mentioned before many times, beliefs come before logic. There is an emotional attachment to every decision we ever make, no matter how small that decision. And note, that is not always a bad thing. It's important to recognize that the ego isn't actually a thing. Everyone who describes the ego usually describes it as an amorphous construct of self and identity, our basic human impulses, our animalistic selves, or even our truer selves. If we could just control our impulses, insecurities, and pride, then maybe we could finally just be the person we were always meant to be. The definition of ego changes depending on who you talk to and on the field of study. But there is a reason why. My explanation of ego actually has a defined point that I can reference and replicate. If I go into the 10 layers of processing, I associate ego all the way down here in the abstract and instinctual. Most definitions usually hit the subliminal and abstract level. The reason I place ego all the way in the lower levels is because our core emotions actually start in the instinctual level. Why did you feel that emotion? Why did you think that thought? Because deep down in our unconscious, alongside our heart rate processing, we simply wanted to. Why, you may ask? Well, that's a video for another time. But for now, the ego starts down here, and it simply says, I want. The ego is the core engine of survival and sustainability. You're hungry and want food? That is the ego. But it doesn't just have to include primal desires. You are lonely and want spirituality? That is also ego. Ego is the core driver of what creates our emotions, which creates our beliefs, which creates our frameworks. But again, maybe I can make another video about ego and emotions. But, for example, I used the color test at the beginning to try to drive a wedge between an established pattern you had already been raised to believe since birth and a potential new paradigm. Why did you refuse? Take away the social norms, take away the hypotheticals, and all that's left is very simply, you wanted it to stay the same. It felt uncomfortable to change it. There really isn't any other reason. This is why the concept of ego always slants towards the self, because, well, the ego is the self, just not in the way we think about it. It's the core desires of I want. And note, again, that's not always a bad thing. What this means is that because the ego is so deep in our psyche, at no level can you truly ever separate your sense of self from your ego. Your ego is the grand creator of every thought you will ever create. It is the core processor that drives every joy, anxiety, conflict, and every decision. Because on one hand, your ego is all of your base emotions and impulses, but on the other, it's you. And how do you separate your emotions from the concept of you? But it's still more complicated than that. When we zoom back up and out towards the top conscious layer of the processing layers, your whole self becomes a complex system of data points powered by logic, which is powered by beliefs, which is powered by emotions. Here, in the aggregation of everything on top, we can create mental pictures, maps, personalities, and identities. What we want, how we feel, and what we think can all be very different, and we may not even recognize the difference between all of them. Therefore, they are all different frameworks that the brain is trying to piece together. But they still affect each other despite our efforts to isolate them. But then again, what is the engine that creates the drive to isolate them? Hint, hint, this is the ego. The reason this happens is because you can have one set of beliefs on one end and another set elsewhere, or have a value principle that supersedes other value systems, like how in debates the value of nonviolence is stronger than the value of being right. You can also have multiple different frameworks and lenses to look through and speak through. Your work persona is different from your home persona, which is different from your school persona, and your values inside as a person may be separate from your values of how you treat individuals. Another example is when people describe what a conscience is. You do something bad, and then there's a nagging feeling within you that what you did is wrong. To me, all of that is created by the ego. They are all constructs of that core concept of I want, because that is all that the brain can understand. The brain only processes information as a positive or as an affirmation. The royal ego, or the more common definition, which is generally associated with it, is a large aggregation of data points in a framework centered around the belief of I want what's best for me and myself. I myself am the most important. If enough data points become focused on the self going inwards and solely on the self, then we consider the individual egotistical, the Machiavellian narcissistic douchebag that we usually associate with the idea of ego. Now, having a big ego isn't always bad, but we live in a world and we live in society. Now, alongside the ego, there's a concept called ego death that I decided to place here because I kind of hinted at it in my last video. The ego creates frameworks of self and identity centered around beliefs, and all those frameworks create an overall framework of self and identity, which we say, this is me. An ego death is simply when this frameworks of everything breaks. I say the word simply pretty loosely here, because while the action that happens is pretty simple, it's still pretty intense. Kind of like how an earthquake is simple, but it literally, and I mean literally, shakes the world. This time, suppose, hypothetically, that you actually did believe that this color was blue. What do you think it would take to convince you to change that belief? I imagine it would probably take a lot. Almost the same amount of effort as changing a religion or a political party. The effort to change pre-existing paradigms is incredibly difficult because an ego death goes beyond just death of the ego, since the micro-ego of I want is the core engine that sets all of our frameworks of beliefs and philosophies, which then creates our self-identity. The ego death is when this entire framework shatters like a house of crumbling cards. Your ego has to rebuild the frameworks, thus forcing the individual to adopt a new framework, thus forcing the individual to become someone new and different. And this is often debilitating and traumatic. I mentioned in the ego development theory video how when your framework of thought breaks, and if you integrate the new information, you then raise a level. In all cases, in order to raise levels, it requires an ego death. As a last mention, it's a little more complex than this. Two of my criteria of being able to decipher someone's level is first, seeing how complex an individual considers their thought process. How many frameworks can they see and apply at a given time? And second, observing where the individual resists changing new information, or seeing where their ego arises. What causes them discomfort? What causes them resistance? Discover where someone gets frustrated at which complexity, and ask where are they resisting change and why. Alright guys, thank you all for watching. I hope this helped a little bit, and I hope it gives you a more well-rounded understanding of the world. On to the next one. Keep being awesome.